So imagine a thing with human faces. What a treat. And I get to stand up and not worry about being on mute, kinda. Use my clicker and everything. It's genuinely exciting. So, elephant in the room, policy is a really dull thing. It's kind of hard to make it sexy, but I'm going to at least try and get your attention, so bear with me. So, to set the scene, I'm in a lift, and yes, any American friends, if you're in the room, we do really call them lifts. 4 people walk in. I think to myself, Chris, this is your moment, now or never. As the doors close, I position myself in front of them, a captive audience. They're mine. I've got them. I hear them seal shut behind me, and I take a breath. I look to the first person on my left. She's in a suit. She looks really important to her. I gesture to her. See? She looks back at me as if to say, yes, go on. She nods. Oh, perfect. The CIO, the policymaker, the one whose neck is on the block. What are the chances of finding you in my imaginary lift today? I ask her, well, what keeps you up at night? She tells me, I don't know what teams are really doing, what the volume of risk and what I should be showing more interest in. Setting and changing policy is slow and hard to communicate. People just go off and do their own thing. They think they know better, and to be honest, often they do, but I'm left playing catch up with the risk that they've signed me up to. Okay, I say, trying not to sound like a patronising snake oil salesman. I can help. I turn my attention to the second person, also in a suit, look slightly less important. I make a guess. Let's face it, this is my imagination. It'd be weird if I was wrong. Product manager, I say. The whip cracker. What's important to you? Managing risk. So mostly opportunity risk. So the fear of missing out. So getting features out the door, avoiding getting down with, and I glance to the CIO, bureaucracy that is designed almost seemingly to slow me down. Awesome, I say. This is your lucky day. I turn to the next person, dressed in overalls. I'm in a trendy part of town. They could be the CTO. Before I ask, they sense me staring at them. Cleaner. How did you get in my imagination? Okay, I'll come back to you. My attention goes to the last person, hoodie, headphones around the neck. My stereotypical developer. Yes, I know you well. What code do you write, I ask. Doesn't really matter. Python, they answer. Cool, have you got everything updated to work with? I pause. Python 3, they offer? Yes, Python 3. That must have been really hard. They don't know it, but I just kind of won a bit of their trust, which, as we know, is important. Cool, what's important to you? So, staying on top of patching things so we can react to the next fire, knowing what rules exist, what ones we can bend, what I can break, and what ultimately might cause me to lose my job. Writing consistent, good quality code, avoiding technical debt. Ultimately, the rest of my team been able to cohesively work as though we are one. Do you use any tools to help you with that, I ask? So, yeah, linters, code quality, test coverage tools, the usual. Great, I say. I write code too, so let's be friends. I hand them a printed QR code and say, this is my public GPG key, so you know that you can trust what I say. I return my focus to the cleaner. I've got it. How do you get told what to do and when it changes? Well, we get a memo, or maybe something stuck to a notice board. So last week we got a memo saying that all of the meeting room whiteboards needed to be cleaned every night. Interesting, I say. Well, how does that work out? Well, it's then up to us to kind of maintain that to-do list so that we can onboard new people and deal with any kind of consistencies. Does it go wrong at all? Well, yeah. So if sometimes we don't compile our operational manual, we miss a memo, or we don't apply them in sequence, we get things wrong. They glance apologetically to the product manager, like when we hadn't updated the guide that the meeting room on the 3rd floor was being used as a dedicated war room, and we wiped all their boards down. I look to the dev. Sound familiar, I ask? They nod. Turns out we're not all special snowflakes, hey? All is not lost, and I knew that there was a reason that I imagined you here. The lift is slowing. I feel it coming to its destination. Great, I've got the silver bullet for you too. The CIO looks to me, ready to buy literally whatever it is I'm selling. They ask me as the doors open, who are you and what team are you in? As I move out of the way, so to stop obstructing it, I answer, I don't actually work here, I'm just here to fix the lift. People have been complaining that it only goes to the top floor, and no matter what button they push, it's actually pretty slow. My audience storms out, furious, heading towards the stairs, and the door's shut, and I get back to my job. Okay, so if any of this sounds at least vaguely familiar, and you can relate to my imaginary friends, then maybe I might have some answers for you. So, what if I said you could update policy easily? So even releasing several version updates, not just in a year, a month. What about 10 updates in a single day? And seamlessly communicate that to the people that need to consume it without derailing them. You could have visibility on compliance using tools that you perhaps already use. That policy could be readily consumable, easy to pass, demonstrate compliance, make sense, and not be bureaucratic to change when it needs to, and ultimately not get in the way. That same policy could be treated as a dependency and operate like a linter, so you can run compliance checks locally and in CI, and ultimately kind of guard production. That multiple versions of this policy, like a dependency, are supported. So emergencies like you must update now because there's now known vulnerabilities and an older version type updates are a business as usual activity to communicate. Interesting? Okay. Hang around. So how am I doing for time? Am I doing all right? Cool. We can unlock the doors now. I think I've got attention. Cool. So hopefully I've got your attention. It's time to introduce myself and start explaining things. My name is Chris Nesbitt-Smith. I'm currently an instructor for Learn K8s and also for Control Plane, a consultant to, at the minute, Crown Prosecution Service, but generally kind of all over UK Gov, and a tinkerer of kind of open source in the whole. I spent a fair chunk of my professional career now working across UK Gov and large organisations where problems like these are rife. I've been promised that we'll have time for the end, especially as this is the last session of the day, so please kind of give me all your best heckles, and even if we run our way over, you can find me afterwards somewhere. So, given I've got the luxury of a live audience, and most of you have your clothes on for a change, by show of hands, who's with my CIO and has set, written, or applied policy before? Anything. Doesn't matter what sort of policy it might be. It might be a code style for your team, might be any sort of rule that you've set. Cool. Okay, awesome. Fair few. I'm not alone. Okay, so you can put your hands down. So now, next round. Who can tell me who's kind of consciously sought exemption? How many of you have sought exemption or consciously bent, broken, circumvented, ignored, bypassed, whatever, a policy with at least good intentions? Cool. The reason I took a picture will become clear immediately. You fell for it. So, thanks to the organisers, we've got all of your names and employers' details down. So, please put your phones down. The stakes just got raised. Lend me your ears. So, where do I see policy as code going wrong? Well, before we dig into that, what do I mean by policy? Well, it usually comes in one of two forms. So security enforcing, like data at rest being encrypted, or maybe consistency enforcing, such as code style tabs being 2 or 4 space indentation, maybe. Or maybe you can think of some others, but in any case, it's hopefully intended to mitigate a risk of some sort. However, with the best of intentions, these are often emotionally led, rather than being grounded in a proportionate control, which becomes the open door to case-by-case exemptions being required, where you come against a situation that you weren't anticipating. This is not fundamentally unlike how the laws of the land are created, with case law making for a complex-to-navigate rulebook and harder still to measure compliance. It often, therefore, looks like the thin end of a wedge where the precedent, which may have been an uncomfortable pill to swallow the first time round, becomes dangerous, with others looking to expand upon its scope, which can lead us to sometimes wonder if the cure was worse than the disease. But that's not how we at least typically develop software. So why does all of this have to be so hard? There must be a better answer. Well, we've codified everything else, so isn't that the answer? Well, yes, in part, but my point of this talk is that we do it wrong, on the whole at least. So maybe some of you, at least in your heads, can be screaming your favourite product name at me in your heads, and there's a solution, and you're not kind of fundamentally wholly wrong. But the devil's in the detail. Throwing some curly brace or YAML at something doesn't inherently fix things. If it's a security control, it's often tempting to keep the policy a secret. Exposing it could be maybe used against you by an adversary. However, this does not support us shifting left at all. It results in devs effectively reverse engineering what the policy is by finding out when we smash our heads up against it. So it doesn't take much for their imagination to see that in a scenario of an application deploy, midway through finding that one resource is non-compliant and gets rejected, that could leave your overall deploy in an inconsistent halfway state, likely resulting in some downtime. Which begs the question of, was the policy better than the downtime? Especially if it leads your engineers, who are all hopefully plenty smart people that you've gone and hired, finding inventive, shall we say, ways around the computer says no response that they got. This is then further exacerbated when updates to the policy are desired. So maybe you get a pen test or something goes wrong, so you form that new case law and need to apply a new policy. So maybe all S3 buckets now need to be encrypted, a change that could be considered a breaking one. Sure, you might say that you provide warnings on at least the less important issues or new emerging policies, which is a great start, so long as someone sees them. But if you've adopted GitOps, or at least CI/CD in some fashion, is anyone ever seeing those warnings? Who studies the results of a successful build log? Every time. Anyone? Every time? Well, if you are, I'd politely suggest that you're probably missing the point with CI/CD. You should really be able to trust your job status. Okay, well, I'm not just here to throw some stones. Remember my implied promises to my four imaginary friends of what this kind of utopian world might look like. Well, there's fundamentally nothing new under the sun. We've actually already unwittingly solved all these problems elsewhere. We just need to be reminded and to join the dots. Well, the first is something, if you're doing policy as code, you're probably already doing. So put it in version control. The thing you might not be doing, however, though, is making that visible. So at least in a source it, by which I mean allow anyone within your kind of walled garden of employees, suppliers, etc. to see the policy. I'm not saying give all your threat monitoring and intel away. You can probably keep that all to yourself. But I'd argue that visible policy and the gaps therein are often better than the downtime, reverse engineered workarounds, and opaque legacy exemption spaghetti soup. If you're brave, you might even open source it. You'll find that it unlocks an ability to work well with prospective suppliers without NDAs and whatnot, and ultimately widely distributed secrets are expensive to maintain, difficult to handle, and often only stay secret for so long, after all. Okay, well, we're off to a good start. A policy is visible to those that now need to see it. So many of you are no doubt used to semantic versioning, but a quick recap in this context. So the first segment is used to indicate breaking changes, so perhaps conflicting ones in the context of policy. Let's say it's requiring resources to have a department label. Maybe that will help with some internal cross-charging. Who knows, I'm not judging. An increment to that might look like requiring that to be from a predetermined list rather than just being free text. The second segment is used to indicate minor changes that shouldn't really break anyone. An increment to that might look like correcting a spelling mistake on one of the department names. The third segment is to indicate patch changes, so these should be a no-brainer to keep up to date with. An increment to that might look like adding a department to the list of available options. Okay, so our policy is visible in a repository, it's versioned, so we can easily communicate the policy, we can tack on release notes, and expectations are managed by semantic versioning. In software, we're used to handling dependencies. So, what if your policy was just another dependency? You might unwittingly already be doing this, for example, if you have, say, ESLint as a dependency in your JavaScript package, perhaps. Okay, the policy is visible in a repo, it's what version, we can communicate it, we can tack on release notes, and expectations are all managed by Semver. It's beginning to look a lot more like software. Okay, I know this is a dirty word, but in order to make this an asset that everyone can depend on, and also provide some known good examples, tests are essential to give everyone confidence in the stability and surface potential side effects before they ultimately hurt everyone involved. Consumers of this policy need to be able to test themselves against the policy both locally and in CI/CD, thus shortening the feedback loop and better informing everyone. So as a bonus, we should be able to find our consumers able to rely on the artifact that we're sharing with them. Well, we're well and truly on the home stretch. It's a dependency, so updating it should be no different to any other. We can even use some magic like GitHub's Dependable or Mend, now White Source's Renovate, to do that for us. So think automatic pull requests, tests, even auto-merging if you like. Okay, so to check everyone's still with me and you're all still awake, can anyone tell me a recent event that caused people to want to know what version of a certain logging Java doohickey you were potentially running literally everywhere in the estate? Bingo. So yes, as you know, all presentations this year are actually contractually required to reference log4j, even when it's almost entirely out of context, and include some memes about it. So in just a few short months, I can remove these and hopefully just point broadly at a list of scary-looking CVEs in order to command your behavior through fear. But what I'm getting at here, though, is that the situational awareness piece around software supply chain is something that your organization is hopefully already thinking about, as we've seen from some of the presentations today, if it's not already addressing. So, if our policy is a dependency, this is at least not a new problem. So, software bill of materials for the win, right? Which can then lead us to measure the compliance, which will allow us rather to measure the compliance across the estate. Okay, I've just covered a lot of ground and hopefully sounded at least vaguely convincing, and it's not just a fictional utopia that's been painted in PowerPoint. It's time to look at how you might be actually able to do this. And I know you all really came here just wanting to see a million words on a slide and not the just odd emoji or two. So we've reached the point where I get to show you some code. Hooray! But to maintain scope, I'm going to limit this to talking about two things to prove that it's not just one tech or one tool. I've arbitrarily picked Terraform and Kubernetes. I could have probably picked anything. Naturally, I'll need some tools to go along with this. I'm too lazy to really invent much here. So likewise, I'm going to pick two tools. But again, I could have used any, some, or even all probably. Chetkov will be doing my Terraform, and Caverno will be doing my Kubernetes. If you want to browse along with me, the link will be on the screen at the end, then that's the thing. I'm not expecting you to read or grok the code that's on the screen, so don't worry about it too much. It's just to prove that this is at least vaguely real thing. The policy is stored here. So here's where my policy starts at v1.00. I've got policy that here requires a department label on all resources. So long as it's set, doesn't really matter what it is. I've written tests for this, so note how the passing test cases are usable as a great example of what good and bad can look like. And we pushed a tag in Git, we've added release notes, and I can sign it to provide further assurance if my heart so desires, which of course it does. But moving on. So version 2.00 looks similar, now, only now that the department field has to be one of a predetermined list. Like before, tests exist, release notes are written, tags assigned. 2.1.0, where we notice and correct a spelling mistake of one of the options in the list of departments. And 2.1, we've now added that new department to the list. A few more repos that are in that organization. There's app1 and infra1. So app1 is the Kubernetes and infra is the Terraform. And they depend on version 1.00 of the policy. And it's not compliant with version 2.00 or beyond. But how do I know that? Well, I've configured Renovate in this case to actually automatically make me a pull request. So when there's a new version of the policy, it's super obvious, and if I can update my dependency, and I can see clear feedback about where and why I'm not compliant. I can also see all the pull requests over the organization, so I can measure the compliance of my policy as well. Moving on from that, a few more repositories that are there, app2 and infra2, well, they depend on version 2.00 of the policy. However, we could merge the open pull request that's there all the way up to 2.1.1. Finally, app3 and infra3, well, they're dependent on 2.1.1, and they get a gold star from the CIO. There is a small touch of magic here, and it's not pretty. I've written some bash. Don't judge me, even though I probably, definitely, absolutely, constantly written worse. But what this does is it allows me from my dev laptop or in CI to evaluate my code against the version of the policy. Ideally, this might be kind of less cumbersome. It is what it is for now. Pull requests are all very welcome. And the last piece of the puzzle is managing the life cycle of the policy, so allowing multiple versions of the policy to be accepted and evaluated within a single runtime. I've cheated a bit here. Kube gives you admission controllers. It's not so easy, so far as I found, to get the same policy evaluation in a cloud, per se. They've got their own kind of policy engines, so I've not figured out how to be able to kind of evaluate their policy code. It's like an SCP for Amazon or whatever. Been able to evaluate that locally. Again, pull request, contribution, collaboration, all very welcome. So you may have noticed the way the policy is designed and distributed. It lends itself well to kind of coexist with itself in a Kubernetes cluster. Which brings us to a few more repositories. So we've got cluster 1. So this describes a cluster that accepts all the versions of the policy that we've described so far, by which we've applied that policy YAML of each version to it. Likewise, cluster 2, well, that only accepts version 2.00 and greater. And we can automate, automate to demonstrate this using Kind for CI, and we can deploy some apps, and there you go. And then we have it, a full org, all done, all compliant, policy, all versions, CIO, all aware of what's going on. So this is great, right? But just one more thing. Wouldn't it be awesome if the policy carried a story of why it exists? After all, if your agile teams are even half effective, they'll reject anything that it perceives as being friction if it doesn't see the value in it. So therefore, it could allow our devs to know kind of why they're compliant. And if they want to do something outside of what the policy permits, they don't need any sort of exemption granted per se. They can go and have a well-reasoned and informed debate with rationale behind a pull request to the policy. So imagine, if you will, this going through a stage of versions with risks that inform the mitigations manifested as policy and all maintained as one. So when the risk landscape changes, your policy can move with it. So when some new policy regulation comes out, or your latest marketing strategy pays off for you and you acquire more data perhaps, even if your policy was perfect at one time, the risks and the appetite will stand still for no one. So we can liken this to perhaps say over-provisioning that we might be familiar with from elsewhere, where lead times are long, change is hard, and there's a significant pressure in nailing it the first time, which can lead to hedging our bets against what some future state might look like, rather than proportionate mitigations to risks that are more tangibly real in the now. And that's where the real culture change is needed. And the execution of that is probably a kind of long series of talks in of itself. So now this is all kind of over to you, really. Honestly, the best thing you could do right now is tell me this is mad. Already done, irrelevant, or otherwise just unachievable, something my esteemed kind of echo chamber peers have yet to do. So beyond making some pull requests and developing the theory more, I'd really like to start building a case study with kind of willing and real organizations, and continue to allow me to swap out some of my imaginary friends for some real ones. But the most important thing that I want you to remember from our time together is, and feel free to say this out loud with me, purposeless policy is potentially, practically pointless policy. I've been practicing saying that far too many times. So, I've been Chris Nesbitt-Smith. Thank you so much for your time. You're now free to leave, and I'll destroy the evidence of your guilt admissions earlier. I'll try, maybe. Like, subscribe, whatever the kids do on LinkedIn, GitHub, whatever. And you can be rest assured there'll be kind of next to no spam or much content at all, since I'm awful at self-promotion, especially on social media. CNS.me just points at my LinkedIn. And talks.cns.me contains this and other talks, and they're all open source.